This next session is time for you all to ask questions, and by saying you all, I include the people who are watching the webcast of the meeting. So if anyone has a question or an extremely short comment, we invite them now. Michael?
Okay, Mike Dorsey with Toxicology Excellence for Risk Assessment. I very much enjoyed this policy discussion this morning. It's an area I don't get into very often, so I really enjoyed it. So I have a comment to Dr. Portney. Dr. Portney, I can't help you with your wildest dreams, and I especially can't help you with your wife's version.
I made that up for the record. But.
Oh, you'll pay for that later, I'm sure. But I think I can help you with your nightmare. Okay, so I'm a biologist. I've been doing this 30 years, setting safe levels for chemicals in the environment. You've heard many times that thresholds don't exist. Well, I'm here to tell you that's not correct. Thresholds for adverse effect exist. I work with medical colleagues. We deal with this all the time. You can get effects down to low doses, and you can actually measure them, but they're not adverse effects. So you can drink dihydrogen monoxide and get all sorts of effects. So I want to pose a little thing here. We have 37 trillion cells in our body. Each cell makes protective enzymes, and they make enough to protect themselves to daily stressors like ozone, and they make a little bit more. The reason they don't make a lot more because it takes energy. The reason they make a little bit more is because it takes energy to crank up the system. Mm-hmm. So once they crank up the system, they take enough plus a little bit more. So I can assure you that the human body can handle background levels of ozone plus a little bit more. You're not going to get into this nightmare where someone finds an effect at 40 parts per billion of ozone. I mean, you'll find an effect, but it's not going to be adverse because your body makes protective enzymes. There may be individuals who exist, or I would say there are no individuals that exist without protective enzymes unless they're in the morgue or they're under medical supervision. So one of the protective enzymes we talked about yesterday was ascorbic acid, also known as vitamin C. If you have no vitamin C in your body, you're under medical supervision for scurvy. All right, so this is what I'm talking about. And none of the health people protect the sensitized individual on medical supervision. It's sensitive subgroups. So I just want to assure you, you don't have to worry about this nightmare of some very low level finding an effect that's adverse, because you're not going to find it. And I would invite my medical colleagues to add to that or maybe subtract.
And I'll respond, I can only respond on one point. Adverse, the term adverse, like adequate, sensitive, is in the eye of the beholder.
Well,
so.
And I would say if it's the eye of the beholder as a medical person, I would honor that, and then the medical people can talk about what is adverse.
Okay.
But it's just not just not any effect is adverse. But thank you.
Roger?
Yeah, Roger McClellan, Albuquerque, New Mexico. I really enjoyed the dialogue this morning, the presentation of each of the four presenters in terms of the details of the law and then the economic picture. And the economic picture that Paul pointed out, I thought was absolutely fascinating. What I think we've missed at this conference is that kind of big picture view of health and what are the factors that influence health. We unfortunately here at this conference, as at so many different meetings I participate in, talk about a risk factor, a single risk factor. In this case, ozone, within kind of context of air quality. That's become a growth industry in terms of parts of the biomedical community, because you can study a risk factor I think I've worked on both ends of the spectrum, risk factors, and over at the far side, health. I had the good fortune, misfortune, if you will, for a period of time to have a senior executive position, which is part of it, was involved with the creation of the first HMO in New Mexico. And I learned an awful lot about health insurance, the multitude of factors that are involved. There was no diagnostic category for ozone-related respiratory diseases. There are categories for respiratory diseases. And I would submit that by and large, the role of air quality in terms of those respiratory diseases, depending whether I want to put it at the top of the list, it's that fuzzy area that maybe is influencing something, or down at the bottom. But it has so much attention because we have a national fixation with victimhood. And along with victimhood, we got to have culprits. So our culprit here is ozone, and somehow those people who are involved in producing ozone on it. And we've created the illusion in the public, I think, a misrepresentation of the disease. I could ask the question across the group, how many of you think ozone causes asthma? You don't have to show your hands, just all like questions.
I think
My understanding of the disease, from my medical viewpoint, is no. In fact, we have a very foggy notion of what actually causes asthma. Does exposure to high levels of air pollution exacerbate asthma? Yes, certainly does. So why am I asking about that? Well, the genie in my computer kept trying to jump out on me, and that genie was a recording from President Obama. And he wanted to talk about climate change and impact, and then segued to the environment, to respiratory. And I quote, well, you know, Malia had asthma when she was 4. And because we had good health insurance, we were able to knock it out early, end quote. And, quote, if we make sure that our responses to the environment are reducing those incidents, that's something I think every parent would wish for, end quote. Well, what's that have to do with this? I think President Obama, with all due respect, like many others, thinks there's a very tight relationship between his daughter's Malia and the occurrence, air quality, the environment, and her asthma attack. I'm disappointed to tell him I'm sorry, that's misfounded. The position I think we are in is that we've had a politicization in terms of this linkage between a single risk factor and a disease outcome, and everybody's in favor of better health. Unfortunately, I think we're misdirecting our efforts. We ought to be spending more time trying to find out what really causes these diseases and the impact on it, rather than taking the approach of the individual culprits. So I like the conversation yesterday, benefit. I think the more we can put this in perspective, and we were talking about 2 different sets of data. One, the mortality. All you have to do is look at that curve and remember that's relative risk, and we're talking about 1.002 per ppb of ozone. Hey, ozone just isn't a big player in terms of mortality. We look at the exacerbation of asthma, which is part of our concern for the kid riding the tricycle, whatever. That is abstract because we don't really give it context in terms of the trillion of events that occur out there every day that can give rise to an event in terms of that child. So again, I come back to context, perspective, and we've got to do a better job of putting the situation for ozone into the big picture of what are the factors that really impact health. And as we've already discussed many times, that's multifaceted, includes the ability to have jobs.
All right, thank you, Roger. Paul, you?
Yeah, one brief response. Roger, I'm glad you found the panel to be useful. I certainly benefited from my co-panelists' perspectives. While at the margin, after having been at this for 45 or 50 years, I think there are places where we probably spend more money to reduce pollution than the benefits, it seems to me, we probably get from it. You know, don't lose sight of the fact that over the last, since 1970, 45 years, there have been dramatic improvements in air quality in the United States, and during that time, life expectancy has improved, mortality from a whole host of causes has been reduced, morbidity, certain types of morbidity have been reduced, and it would be crazy to me not to think that improvements in air quality have played some role in that. I mean, a lot of other things have contributed to that, including the fact that people have gotten wealthier and see doctors more, et cetera. The question is, having done all of this, at the margin, what's the best way to improve human health with the next dollars that we spend? And having said that, you know, it's easy to say, well, if we didn't spend money reducing the ozone standard or complying with the tighter ozone standard, we could do more good with it if we spent it someplace else. You know, it's not an inappropriate response to say, yeah, but if we don't do the ozone standard, are we going to spend that money on this other thing? Or is it just going to go into somebody's pockets? I mean, that's a fair response to the claim that at the margin, we want to spend this money on public health in the best, most cost-effective way we can. But sometimes if we don't do one thing, it's not going to be spent on the other thing. You have to take that into account.
No, I think, but part of your message, though, I think, is, you know, when you're, quote, wealthy as a society, you can bet on a lot of different things. But as we get into a different economy, and I'm of that same school, we're into a different economy. Now we have to start try to bring some more rationality to how do we spend our dollar? How do we get the best benefit for the dollar spent? And you're just pointing out you have to be very careful in terms of, as you approach that discussion, to make certain that you're going to talk about that in that way.
And if I might, I'll just point out, you know, you talked about the mortality risk being 1.002. Just to reiterate what someone said the other day, from EPA's perspective, that 1.002 applied to the nation of 320 million people yields 640,000 affected individuals. They will say there is benefit to helping those 640,000. You can still have the debate about at what cost. At what cost do you provide that benefit? And that comes into play in considerations of the scientific uncertainty and how certain are we about these health benefits. But I don't think there's anybody that would contend 640,000 individuals is an insignificant number.
Just a couple thoughts on cost calculations, cost benefit, net benefit. During the 90 amendments, OMB Administrator Darman said, geez, if we're going to spend $80 billion, you know, we'd be better off doing mobile mammograph units all around the country. Why are we doing this? This doesn't make much sense. And of course, you know, people said, one, you're not going to spend $80 billion to do the other. So that point about whether the money really would go toward the alternative endeavor. Second, yeah, the 80 billion's made up. It's always overestimated, you know, so those comments were made. The, you know, every day, this cost benefit evaluation is made every day by police departments, hospitals, you know, around, they have a limited budget. And they have to figure out how they're going to spend their dollars for public health benefit. EPA spending someone else's money. you know, and so does that affect the decision-making? People say they want to move it toward a net benefit decision criteria. That was hotly debated in regulatory reform in the mid-90s. Again, be careful what you ask for. In the 90 amendments, we had benefit studies requested of the agency. They've been putting them out. If you look at the benefits calculated, there is little doubt the Clean Air Act is, you know, with no disrespect to the other folks working other media, it's the supersonic jet of environmental regulation, as far as complexity and reach and breadth. Beyond that, though, it may be the most economically impactful regulation that we've seen. It's not just environmental, and so we see that playing itself out now in the ozone discussion. But on the benefits, EPA studies, if you look at the studies, you would ask yourself, why is Congress passing any law but the Clean Air Act? Because of the $1 trillion benefit calculations that are trotted out. Now, I believe there had been significant benefit, but I think just like overestimation of benefits on one side is alleged and in some cases no doubt accurate, the overestimation of benefits, I think, is evidence. But if you are going to design a decision criteria into the next Clean Air Act and say we're going to have a net benefits calculation, who's in charge of making that decision and working the books on that calculation? And that's why Paul's formulation is a little different. It's a little more narrative, take into account, and maybe need to work on transparency and weight and those types of things. But a straight net benefits calculation for many sounds great. Not so sure.
All right, thanks.
Hi, Sabina Lang, Texas Commission on Environmental Quality. In the previous session, when the panel was talking, there was a lot of discussion about uncertainty. And as we've mentioned before, in the proposed rule, the administrator expressed that there was uncertainty in the epidemiology data, and we kind of discussed why in the science panel yesterday. But that information is really the sole basis of the benefits calculations. So how should that uncertainty be translated into those types of calculations? How should it maybe be communicated, and how do you think that affects the policy?
Well, I'll take a quick crack at this. I mean, I think that EPA, Chuck just alluded to an estimate of annual benefits of the Clean Air Act between 2010 and 2030 of nearly $2 trillion, which is, let's see, that's an eighth, so GDP's up a little, 10% of GDP. I don't think anybody believes that. But EPA, they provided a range. I mean, they don't have a statistical confidence interval, but they said benefits could be as low as this and as high as that. And they spell out what accounts for the low end. The low end would be more conservative epidemiological analyses predicting the number of cases of premature mortality, and maybe a lower dollar estimate of the benefits of preventing one case of premature mortality. So if you used Pope et al. And you get a high-end prediction of the number of people who you are preventing from dying early, and then you use a high-end estimate, you get a high estimate of benefits and under a different set of assumptions. So that's I mean, in terms of uncertainty in the statistical sense that you and many other people here are used to, I mean, they're not talking about 95% confidence intervals, but they are trying to say that there's a range of benefits. Is it always the case that the low end of the range is just above whatever the high end of the cost estimates are? Sure. In the same way, people who don't want to see the regulation put in place always have a low end of the cost estimates just above the high end of the benefit range. But there is an attempt to say that our estimate depends on assumptions, and a different set of assumptions would produce a different number.
All right. Let me mention, we've got 3 questions sent in from viewers on the web, and 2 of them I read to be, at least as I understand the expertise on this panel, to be well outside that expertise, but I'll read them quickly and see if we have any volunteers.
That won't stop us.
Well,
Never has.
Well, we'll see. The first one is asked whether there's a different ozone threshold level for short-term transient health effects versus longer-term actual adverse health effects, and should we have an NAQS on short-term transient effects given the sweeping societal impacts of regulation?
I'm not very smart. I'll jump in here. Short-term transient effects, to me, are adverse health effects. I mean, eye irritation or chest tightening is one of that should be considered an adverse health effect, even if 3 or 4 hours later it's gone. Now, would I give that as much weight as something that creates a chronic obstructive respiratory disease or cancer or premature mortality? No. But to me, I just think, who wouldn't think that that's an adverse health effect? Not as serious as others, but that's one of the health effects that I think EPA ought to consider. And if I were the administrator, I'd give lower weight to that than the things that I consider to be more serious. But to me, you can't say that's not an adverse health effect. But
All right. The second one, and I should warn you, Don, the third one is right up your alley. But the
Okay.
second question is from Joanne Alexandrovich of the Vandenberg County Health Department. She asks, notes that the ozone proposed rulemaking includes revisions to the air quality index with related health effects messages. She says, I have concerns that these messages are not clearly evidence-based. What is the sense of the panel members on the AQI in general, and specifically to the revisions proposed?
I think it should be combined with the Transportation Safety Administration's, like color warning system for the danger of terrorist attacks. If we could put those 2 together, we would have more colors, and it would be more in the public health. That's what I have to say.
All right, now, this is the one that I think, Don, you are the expert on. It comes from Donna Wood with BP America. What would be the most effective way to attack the failure of EPA to address the negative health effects from lower ozone, such as the NOx disbenefit issue in the center of urban areas, and the failure to look at health effects from the loss of jobs and income? Would OMB be the best influencer on this issue, or is this a later court issue? Is there a way to utilize Congress on this issue?
Yes.
All right.
No, sorry. Yes, OMB is, first of all, we've talked a lot over the last 3 days about these issues. So it's not, and I don't remember specifically, but I believe probably in that 5,000 pages of stuff, the EPA does address those, and some of our speakers have addressed some of those issues. OMB is a possible target, but I mean a possible target of comment. But the time is very short now to the final rule, and the OMB administrator, director, and the president are undoubtedly communicating with the EPA administrator in trying to figure out what to do. So I would think that it would be good to try to get that message, as Chuck suggested, to EPA in any way possible, and but be ready to use it in the amicus briefs, and be ready to take it to your local congressman.
Yeah, if
or
I
person.
might follow on to what Don said. There are written comments before the agency right now that raise the health issues. I'm not aware of what has been submitted on the NOx, specific issues about urban NOx levels, but I'm guessing it's probably in the record somewhere. What you have to remember is that right now what we have is a proposal. A proposal is EPA's initial idea about what it wants to do. It is not the final rule. When EPA issues a final rule, it is obligated by law to address all the comments it receives. It is going to grapple with these things in its responses to comments. Whether the rule ultimately will be influenced by those things depends on how EPA treats them. It can explain them away, it can adopt them, and it can adjust. So we need to wait in some sense to see what EPA does at the end of the day. This is the time to go in and to enforce those points in your discussions with EPA and with OIRA to try and influence the outcome of that EPA analysis. But wait and see what they do, because they will have to address these issues because they have been raised.
Let me just speak for a minute about communication. During the break, someone came up and talked to a few of us about communication in this area, and it goes to the prior question about risk and communication with AQI indices. I'm not familiar with that specific change. I am very familiar with, as we all are, with presenting arguments and words matter. Choice versus abortion. The use of the language you use in a discussion really matters. And I go back to a discussion I had with Congressman Madigan in 1989. He pulled me into his office and he gave me a little toolkit that was being handed out by environmental organizations in his district for primary school children. And it was a great little toolkit to measure the acidity of rain. And as you all remember, in the 80s, acid rain was, the vocalized threat of the day. And of course, he said, when they go outside of their house and they grab a cup and measure this, it's always going to show acidic because rain's naturally acidic. And so he said, can you go talk to some of the folks in the industrial sector about what, if anything, they're doing regarding, science education in primary schools and all the rest. And I did that, and it was like crickets. I mean, there was very little going on. And so, this specific question deals with the disbenefits and communication, but some thought needs to be given to how the health is articulated and in a way that is persuasive. And I just throw that out as a thought-provoking exercise for those in the room.
Thanks, Chuck. Next question.
Thank you. Andrew Hoeksema, Capital Area Council of Governments. So I'm going to preface this by, I'll say that for the next couple minutes I will be speaking as a citizen of Texas as opposed to in my professional capacity. But I want to just say that I really appreciate the discussion here, and I agree that having sort of science people and policy people and legal people together and economic analysis people together is a really informative discussion. I think for this discussion, what intrigues me is that I think what most people are concerned about with the implications of setting a standard at, say, 65 parts per billion is what the follow-on consequences of having to implement those standards under the Clean Air Act as written would be. And we saw some preview of that, of what an estimate of that might be if it was followed basically in accordance with the scheme that Congress set up in 1990. If sort of every state followed what that scheme laid out, here's what it would cost to do to get all these areas down to 65 parts per billion by 2022. I think, though, that if we had this same conversation and, EPA had done all of the things that everybody's identified in here for that NAAQS review process and still came to a conclusion that it was 65, or if everybody agreed that it would be 65, and that's really the healthy standard level, I think people would still be saying, well, we should look at the cost in some capacity as a society on air quality regulation. To me, it's sort of the wrong argument to be having is what the NAAQS setting process should be, as opposed to what is the implementation process. Would we be as concerned about a 65 part per billion standard if areas had 20 years to attain it as opposed to 3 years to attain it? And so to me, if the discussion is how do we account for these costs in this decision-making process, and I too sort of enjoy thinking about if I had the opportunity to rewrite parts of the Clean Air Act, what would I put in there? But I think that, there are, I'm sure, a few people in here who, for them, the most important thing is, communicating the right information in the NAAQS about what a healthy level is. But I think that for many of the rest of us, there are many, I had a question a couple days ago about other countries. We're not the only country that sets air quality standards. You look at Japan, European Union, India, South Korea, World Health Organization, they all have come up with basically lower levels of ozone as being the safe level compared to us. I'm less concerned about that than the fact that we have a really prescriptive regulatory scheme set up in 1990 based on particular circumstances that were in place at that time. So I just appreciate some feedback from y'all on that distinction between the NAAQS setting process as opposed to the implementation.
Yeah, I think that's just an excellent point. I started my talk by noting that in 1981 there was the belief that costs can be kept out of the NAAQS setting process because costs would be taken into account with implementation. In the 90 amendments, there was many states were concerned about the inability to have the political wherewithal to impose the level of requirements necessary to reach attainment. So that's why the graduated scheme was developed with the increased federally mandated requirements as depending on the severity of the problem. That was the response to that. SIP flexibility had been the norm before that, and then it became, no, this is the process. The ability to engage costs is constrained in the implementation process. That's your point, and it's a very legitimate point. Yes, there's some things that can happen. You can bump to a higher level. Time. We all know time matters. People can do almost anything at some point. That's why in the industrial sector it really matters. Are you doing changes in imposing pollution control equipment during normal changeover processes at industrial sources, or is there some reason that it needs to happen tomorrow? If it happens tomorrow, all right, it's got to happen tomorrow, but the cost is huge, as opposed to doing things during normal turnover cycles. And this is a constant thing we see in how to structure cost-effective regulation. But I think, so there's a break on time, you can bump up, and as noted, I think yesterday in a question, you bump up, but the price for that, of course, is more prescriptive requirements that may not be the ones that the area, are best for the area. So your general point is very well taken as to focusing on that may be because changing the standard, I think, is going to be really, really difficult and has unintended consequences, as opposed to focusing on implementation adjustments.
I think what Chuck said is absolutely right, that there are opportunities to get additional time. They have consequences, which is when you bump up to a more severe non-attainment status, it comes with additional obligations to do enhanced I&M and do offsets and so forth that also have their own costs. But going to 65 parts per billion is not purely a cost issue here or a time issue, because we are now running down to a level where, at least in certain parts of the country, a 65 part per billion standard hits natural background levels. And now you run into an issue of impossibility. Can you even get there? And one of the questions that people are grappling with right now is attainability and maintainability a necessary component of setting a NACS? There is a case out there involving, I think it was Houston, in which the court said the fact that Houston can't attain it is not relevant. But that was one area of the country, one small, discrete area. I know Houston's not small, but it was one area. Now we're looking at a standard that may have impossibility implications for significant portions of the country, and significant portions of the country where they're really rural areas, where there's not much you can do at all to bring your levels down. So even providing additional time to those areas wouldn't solve their problem. They just can't get there. EPA has said it's going to try and craft some relief for those areas in terms of the exceptional events rule, in terms of rural transport area designations, and in terms of some other international transport areas. It's not clear yet that those will be effective mechanisms of relief. We don't know what's in them yet. So there is a problem here.
Just to clarify, part of my point was, we're having this discussion about the NAC setting process in the context of the Clean Air Act as written right now, but all of you are obviously also thinking about, well, if the Clean Air Act was written differently, what might that look like? So I'm just saying, if the discussion is just Section 109, you're missing all of the rest of the implementation aspects of it. And there are many other countries that have other ways of doing this that we haven't really even fully investigated.
Your point about implementation is really important, and and you have sort of successfully characterized the discussion we've been having as reflecting the general fact that in Washington for national policy, implementation is a poor handmaiden to the statutory process. So with all those Congress people running around and the president having to sign it, it's a big deal when the Clean Air Act gets developed and so on. And for a lot of people, passing the statute, that's it. We passed the statute, so we're healthier, right? So it satisfies everybody's sense of the need for safety, the public's general need for safety, and the morning after, things are the same. It's not, they don't have to, there's no penalty, there's no consequence yet. And then a year or two or 3 or 5 or 10 later, a regulation comes up. And the regulation may get into the A section of the major newspapers, probably not the front page, maybe a day. There'll be an editorial in the Wall Street Journal and a counter-editorial in the New York Times. And then, the standard goes into effect, and nobody hears about it except everybody in the states that now has to start that implementation process. So I just wanted to sort of underline your sense that implementation is where the government meets the public, and it is a part of the process that is generally not focused on and should be.
And I'd like to amend what Don said in one minor way. He used the term implementation is the poor handmaiden. That's true, but there's an even poorer handmaiden, and that's enforcement. Congressmen love to write laws and have their names on laws saying there'll be no adverse health effects, waters will be free of pollution, etc. There's a big drop-off in interest when it comes to implementing, and an even bigger drop-off when it comes to enforcement. And so, and this is true in both Republican and Democratic administrations to differential degrees, but we spend a hell of a lot less time enforcing laws and hiring people to do that job than we do even to implement the law. So There's the law, there's the implementation, and then there's the enforcement, and in decreasing orders of importance.
Well, let me amend Paul's comment briefly. U.S. federal regulation has an innovation in it, different from other countries. Citizen suits, and so I agree with your progression with respect to the progression within the federal government, but one reason for that is the citizen suit potential, and I know many in the audience are aware of the next generation of enforcement, initiative that EPA has and DOJ has, and so anyway, I just point that out.
I accept your amendment.
Well, I'd like to amend what both of these guys said, which is beyond the citizen suits, although it's hard to see from 2 year to 2 years, there is an elective system in the country that elects the people that control, in terms of implementation, really the budgets that are available. And it's just possible that they will start to worry about this if they are prodded and reminded. But you have to be patient and have a long-term point of view with these issues. As you've heard, everybody's been doing this all their life, and here we are, still talking about the same things.
Well, let me offer one kind of related observation. As I read materials that were sent to me in preparation for this meeting, and I can thank Tara for sending me the full 4 feet of paper, I think, I was struck by the fact that the form of the standard has multiple components, and yet only one of those, that is to say the 8-hour average fourth highest occurrence, appears to be on the table. And I said, why 8 hours and why fourth highest? And look at all the degrees of freedom you have to turn knobs here. And I came away without a clear answer other than I think that we don't want to get into more fights than we need to, and we've already settled these issues, so let's just pick the one central number and deal with it. So, anyway, next
Well,
question.
you're absolutely right. Form of the standard, it's made up of several components, the standard itself, and they, in conjunction with one another, influence stringency.
Yes.
And that is critical, and there has been discussion on alternative forms and averaging time. But it needs to, that discussion is useful. Hasn't been as extensive as some would like to see, but at the end of the day, it's still going to have to correlate to the science. However, the stringency is selected by adjusting the numerical limit and the averaging time. It's still going to have to be correlated.
Julie.
Julie Goodman from Gradient. Earlier, Sabina asked Paul about incorporating uncertainty into the benefits, and Paul indicated, well, the uncertainty is there. You have a range. But many have argued and have shown that does capture some of the uncertainty, but not all of it. Starting with the studies themselves, issues we talked about yesterday, like exposure measurement error and confounding, and then even EPA classifies health endpoints as causal or likely causal. When they go to the risk assessment, that's gone. That's meaningless. Both causal and likely causal are evaluated, even though likely, by EPA's own definition, there's less confidence that there's something going on there. And I maintain that at low exposures, we have no idea what's happening. Like with any other substance, as exposure goes up, health risks go up. But we know 1 molecule of ozone, 2 molecules of ozone isn't going to hurt anyone, not even sensitive people. And the question I want to ask is, what is the point? It seems to me that policies are based on saying, this is the science we have, these are the studies we have to make a decision, so we'll take the best in front of us and make a decision based on that. But can't you say, well, wait a minute, even the best we have just has too many uncertainties that we really don't know what it means, and let's just pick a number out of a hat because that would be as equally protective?
Well, it's, yeah, you've got a valid point. There are uncertainties here. EPA is acting in the face of great uncertainties. It is not permitted to decline to act based on that. It must have a rational basis, though, for what it does. The case law guides this. It goes back quite a way. I'll read you something else. We'll go back to Lead Industries Association. Court found that Congress specifically directed the administrator to allow an adequate margin of safety to protect against effects which have not yet been uncovered by research, and effects whose medical significance is a matter of disagreement. That's EPA's task. It's a very, very difficult task. As Don was saying, you don't want to be EPA administrator, ever.
I would never want that.
Ever. Because you have to grapple with that on a daily basis. And for every study that you show that shows this uncertainty at a low level, someone from EDF can put out a different study that says, no, that's wrong, there's more certainty than that, or the effects are more profound. The administrator is tasked with acting in the face of great uncertainty and providing an adequate margin of safety. That adequate margin of safety requirement has a tendency to drive these standards lower than you might otherwise set them if you required empirical certainty.
You raised the question as to should some highly uncertain effects not translate into the risk assessment, essentially. We're not going to do it because it's too uncertain. Or you need to figure out a way to articulate that uncertainty in the risk assessment itself. I think that's what your concern is, that there's some highly uncertain effects that, in your view, didn't warrant moving into the risk assessment piece of it, because all those uncertainties dropped away when the risk assessment was done. Correct?
Yeah, that's part of it. And even
Yeah.
as part of the risk assessment process, a lot of the uncertainties aren't carried through. Like Apex model does not put in confidence intervals. It just gives you a number.
Right. So the solution is it's either not going to move into it, or you develop a way to characterize the uncertainty in the risk assessment.
So if you
We
put in
can-
that uncertainty, and then as opposed to the range of benefits going from 0 up to a number, it actually goes from negative up to a number, now what do you do?
Let me
Well,
observe.
similar to the study we saw where they, 44 out of 50 states had the bands crossing the null effect.
Well, if it's negative, that means the policy will cause more harm than good, right?
Let me note that just as Paul traced the origins of how we got a Clean Air Act that didn't ask that cost be considered, that if you go back into risk management 30 or 40 years, we had a thing called the Delaney Amendment that banned anything known to be carcinogenic from the food supply, period, in any concentration. And an old friend once made the comment to me that, chemicals are not innocent until proven guilty. So I don't think that the uncertainty weighs in the side of EPA having the burden of proof. Necessarily in standard setting.
But EPA absolutely does consider uncertainty. Absolutely.
Yeah, I would agree that they consider it to a degree.
Well,
They-
and so let me, and not in a way that it will ever be satisfactory to you or good scientists. No, I mean that. I mean that as a compliment. I mean, if you think about what a final regulation would look like, we've been laughing about documents 2 feet high. I mean, if they had to explain the 8 or 10 sources of uncertainty that you talked about on one of your slides, which I don't have in front of me, and all the other things, the documents would be 50 feet high. I mean, it's never going to be perfect. It's far from perfect now. Maybe what we ought to talk about is a way to be a little bit more sophisticated about expressing the uncertainties, but good statisticians or biostatisticians or econometricians will never, be completely happy with what EPA is able to do given the time and money and other constraints that they have when they present risk assessments or regulatory impact analyses. I just think, perfection is a good goal, but we're certainly never going to get there.
I think you also just have to remember that though science is a critical portion of this, an absolutely critical portion of this, a significant portion of this is also a political policy judgment. And that is the way the statute is written, in the administrator's judgment. That judgment is informed by the policy of the current administration. And that policy will vary from administration to administration. How much, how little they consider these uncertainties and the costs is going to vary every 4 years or every 8 years.
All right, next question, please.
Hi, Alina Kraft, Environmental Defense Fund. First of all, I apologize for not being able to make the happy hour last night. I really enjoy those opportunities, and I think I'm a lot more fun after a couple of beers. At least that was one thing I did learn in graduate school. And I appreciate the discussion over the last couple of days. I guess just a few comments, and I would like some feedback. I think I can see why folks who have attended over the last couple of days might leave here thinking that the science is soft, or that we don't have enough certainty around some of the health effects. If we look at the articles that have been presented over the last couple of days, Kim et al., Smith et al., Schlegel, Jarrett, those are all studies that were done since the 2008 review. So, my assessment is that the data are going in the direction that we need to be more health protective, not less. The issue of uncertainty, we're talking about studies that are going down to 60 part per billion. They're looking at perfectly healthy human beings with effects statistically significant at 15 part per billion below the current standard. Now, 500,000 people have submitted comments to EPA in support of the standard. I mean, those people include American Academy of Pediatrics, American College of Chest Physicians, American College of Occupational and Environmental Medicine, Asthma and Allergy Foundation of America, American Lung Association, American Medical Association, American Heart Association, American Thoracic Society, Physicians for Social Responsibility. These are not people who are there for a free t-shirt. And I think that has gotten lost in this discussion over the last couple of days, in part because I don't think that we have heard from those folks who could have presented the alternate side of the science that has been discussed over the last couple of days. I would say that one specific thing is, let's see. EPA is right to give deference to positive findings in studies. If I go in for a mammogram and the results come back and they're uncertain, I'm going to go back and have another checkup. You don't say, well, it's uncertain, so I'm just not going to worry about it. I mean, that's not what you do in your day-to-day life, and it's not what we should do when we're trying to set standards that are looking at protecting the 320 million people that live in this country. So I think, that perspective, I hope, would resonate at least a little bit with this group and sort of understanding why NRDC, why Earth Justice, why Environmental Defense Fund, why Sierra Club, why Moms Clean Air Force, why all of these medical and public health communities have been supportive of the standard. I mean, that is the reason. And then just a couple of final comments on the costs. I think, well, one comment about TCQ's presentation. I think that the work and the research that they've done is interesting. It hasn't made it into the peer-reviewed literature yet. It doesn't nullify the existing body of work that's out there. So I think we need to temper those findings with the fact that we need to get it into peer-reviewed literature and understand what it really means. The other thing on the cost side, we had presentations, 3 actually yesterday, talking about the cost. They were an order of magnitude greater than what EPA had estimated. And really no one batted an eye about the ocean of difference between those two. We could have had some more discussion about what, an alternative viewpoint to those discussions. The health assessment is interesting. I think that health disparities depend on more than just environmental standards. I think an argument can be made, for instance, that the mortgage lending disaster caused more disparity than any environmental regulation that has ever been passed or is going to be passed in the future. And then just one more comment. We also didn't have a discussion about healthcare costs in this country and the benefits that this rule could bring, given the uncertainty around some of the numbers. But that would have been, I think, a benefit as part of the panel here. From at least the folks that I've talked with, none of those groups were invited to speak on the panel, and I think we're all engaged in terms of trying to be a part of this discussion and appreciate the viewpoints and the perspectives of everyone here. And so I would just encourage, I feel like I'm accessible to everyone, so I encourage folks reaching out to me, and I hope that you all feel the same. Just because I think the divisiveness and the polarization that exists isn't good for anyone, and that's not something that we're looking to do. Really, we're trying to protect the public health of this country in the best way that we know how to do, and with the best science and knowledge and information that we have. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Comments?
Yeah, I'd like to respond. First of all, thank you very much. And even though you and I might disagree at how much it's worth at the margin to prevent a particular kind of health effect, I sure wouldn't want to live in a country where there aren't people who articulately and enthusiastically remind us that one of the reasons we have a law like this is protection of public health and endangered ecosystems, et cetera. And I guess I would go one step further and say that, as I said at the start, I think Michael disagreed with me, but at some point somebody is going to do a very convincingly done study that will find an adverse health effect in at least some people at a much lower level than we have been talking about in this conference. And to me, maybe not to Elena, but to me, that doesn't necessarily mean that we have to move the standard down and set it there. I've made clear my view that I think we have to say, well, how disruptive would it be? But it wouldn't surprise me in the least if there are studies a year from now that show effects at 5 parts per billion or something like that. So, and I think we have to pay attention to what those studies say. That's a critical element, an input into the decision at which the standard should be set. So, thank you.
Any other comments?
Well, I just want to also echo, thank you for attending. The environment for discourse has changed. And over the years, I look back, and there are certain kind of seminal events that I see having tremendous effect on things, and one of them was. People will cringe, but the Bork hearings. To me, that was a seminal change in D.C. as to how people talk to one another, and I think I think it's great that you're here. And I guess what just speaking to the substance of it, of a couple of your comments, what is this an area where reasonable people can disagree as to what the outcome should be? It appears to be. I think I heard enough about uncertainties regarding the new science that, and if you're looking at a revision, so you have a standard that just recently was set and upheld, that was viewed as requisite to protect public health. And then you have new information that is being looked at, as well as a reanalysis of old information. But the administrator needs to say, is this body of work that I'm looking at, does it compel a tightening of the standard or not? Or should I be looking at things, or should I defer and drill in on particular things? There is no doubt there's a strong perspective that it absolutely needs to be tightened off the recently set standard. I think we saw evidence of benefit, secondary and primary, in attaining the current standard. And there's a cost of doing that. And it was just vaguely alluded to a few times, just the kind of management of change that affects implementation. And I would be thinking about as part of it, I would be thinking, as I said, the certainty of the information, the certainty of the benefits, and also, is it the time to overlay another standard, another implementation scheme into the process? Or do we look at the science further and button down some of the uncertainties and nail down the benefits? I think a case could be made for that. I don't think that's going to be the outcome. I think it'll be a tightening of some level based on everything I see happening. But I guess I was looking at it as the body of science. And anyway, those are a few thoughts.
If I might just briefly, I'm not going to get into the science because, I recognize that there's a lot of room for EPA to maneuver in terms of the science, in terms of what it wants to rely on. I know that there are scientific studies on both sides. We've heard about some of them here over the course of this session, and I asked some of the scientists here to, what do those who disagree with you say? And how would you respond to that? And so there is a debate going on clearly as to those effects. I think you identify a very salient point on the health discussion. I appreciate that you acknowledge that ultimately what you do want to get to is a standard that is net beneficial to public health. We don't want to set one that doesn't benefit the public. That wouldn't make sense. Probably wouldn't be upheld in court. The salient disagreement is the one that you identified. What are the costs to the nation of setting the standards at various levels? And I get that there is wide disagreement on that. How that issue is presented to EPA and how EPA cuts through that and tries to resolve those disagreements, I think is going to be very important ultimately to deciding whether this standard is net beneficial or net negative. So, again, I don't know the answer. I don't envy Gina McCarthy trying to decide this right now. But there is a process for them to resolve this, and it'll move towards some resolution.
So just a comment as well. I found the discussion, as Chuck alluded to, quite convincing about some of the uncertainties, and I'm sympathetic, in any case, to the difficulty that the administrator has in both protecting public health in both a scientific but also in a very public and political way. That's her territory in the government. That said, I will also add that when I was at OMB, parties would come in and argue a case, and I'd say, well, that's pretty cut and dried. No counter argument there. It's pretty obvious. And then the next day, having heard that their opponents came in to talk to us, the other side would come in to talk to us, and they would offer a case, and I'd say, whoa, I guess this is the case. I guess this is. So it's very hard to imagine what legitimate opposing arguments would be without them being made. So I sympathize in that respect.
Tim?
Thank you. First of all, the conference has been really engaging, and I'm grateful for the folks down here who organized it. It's been very informative. I was trying to think to myself what it sort of feels like as an observer primarily, and I came up with this notion that it's sort of like being an engineer or a group of engineers, marine engineers, and we've come down to the dock because we've got important news, only the Titanic has just left Southampton. And we kind of, we have some preordained notion as to what might happen because there's some fundamental flaws that we've become aware of. But how do we get them communicated? How do we avoid the calamity that might occur offshore? Is there some way to inform the voyage such that we can steer a different course? What can we do, practically speaking, to get out into the broader community or into broader consideration some of the ideas that we've bandied about here today? And let's all be cognizant of the fact that ozone, while a criteria pollutant, is not the same as PM 2.5, where we have a different body of knowledge, a different level, some would say, of certainty, a whole more rigorous approach in terms of the epi studies and how long they've been in extant. So, you know, while we're dealing certainly with potential health effects, it's not mortality from what a lot of people would tell us. And the acute effects are perhaps transitory and perhaps, relatively speaking, somewhat minor. So what can we do in the face of a decision that has significant ramifications other than the usual, other than going to talk to OMB, going to talk to EPA staff? Because the frustration there is when you're talking to those people, they have one government-issued document that they speak from, and that is the rulemaking, the KSAC letter, and the supporting documents. We have other things, some of which are published in the scientific literature, some of which are not, but we don't have the same type of gospel to bring to people that they're reading on their own. And so one thing that Chuck brought up that I think is important to consider is whether or not we can help develop a new government-issued, government-sanctioned view of some of these issues, and that is to go to the National Academy of Science, go to the National Research Council and say, look at some of these issues, do it as fast as you can. We probably cannot divert the course of the Titanic initially. It's going to hit something. But maybe we can do a better job of rescuing the flotsam and jetsam. So what might we commission NAS, NRC to look at? And here are a couple things. Maybe look at the current dynamics of ozone formation and ozone reduction in the various NOx and VOC limited regions across the United States. Because it's not just a ubiquitous, uniform, linear air pollutant like PM 2.5. It's different chemistry in different places, and it has different ramifications. One issue. What's the magnitude and range of uncertainties of health impacts, as postulated from the key clinical and epi studies, of ozone levels from fully implementing the current standard of 75 ppb, taking background and threshold issues into account? One issue we've been discussing is, hey, if you let the current standard phase in, you might well end up at a level across the country that is protective with an adequate margin of safety. And some of the presentations that we've seen showed that. So that's another issue. Another issue that's worthy of investigation. What is the comparative magnitude and range of uncertainties of potential health benefits of implementing a revised ozone standard? And here we saw from some of the other charts and graphs that a reduction down to 70, down to 65, down to even 60, those benefits or those ambient results, health impacts, they kind of lie one on top of the other. So is there really this marginal benefit when things are fully implemented? That's an area worthy of inquiry. And finally, what is the magnitude of potential health disbenefits of implementing a revised ozone standard, including, but not limited to, increased ozone levels in urban centers that we are pretty sure are going to result from a much more aggressive NOx strategy, and health impacts from a regressively impactful economic dislocation from this rule. All of these issues which we've discussed are worthy of further inquiry and are worthy of being opined on by an official agency charged by the government with helping to synthesize science. Otherwise, stakeholders will just be brandished with the same sort of bias brushes when we show up to speak. I think this is critically important. I think it's important that we all come away from this meeting with a uniform action item, and I would submit this is it. Thank you.
Could I just comment on a couple of things? First of all, what comes to OMB for review is not just all the documents that are in that the agency is going to publish, but the OIRA looks at all of the public comment, and then when there is the time and opportunity, any other information that it can use to inform its own review. But that is limited. You're talking about a staff of about 20 analysts that has to cover the regulatory world, domestic world of the entire United States government. A second comment on the Titanic. Actually, the Titanic left in 1789, and it's been trundling across the Atlantic ever since then. I think it's still a long way from, well, I guess the diminishing icebergs if all of the ice melts.
Well, thanks, Tim, for kind of expanding on my kind of random thoughts. I didn't think about, when I burdened my satchel with the weight of this book in 1991, I didn't have that as an action item, but it kind of came to me during the course of the discussions. And I think your list is good. I want to repeat. And maybe it's embedded in your first item. You know, Dr. Goodman's weight of quality of the science, I think, is important. But I also think one other component is specific identification of research. You know, going forward research. Of course, that takes time, and so there's a piece of the report that would be kind of trying to better understand what we already have and what it means, and then, you know, how do we improve that knowledge base?
You know, a separate having an independent view that is to sort of synthesize things independently is very difficult to set up institutionally over time. That's what CASAC was originally supposed to do, and it gets kind of established and so on and so forth. The NAS generally still has a pretty good reputation for independent work. GAO does a lot of very good work, but they're working for the Congress. So OMB does a lot of good work, but they're working for the president. And it's hard to, Congress could make like an independent science agency, I guess, something like an equivalent of the FEC, independent in the sense that the Fed and all the commissions are. That is independent of the president and semi-independent of the Congress. It's just that they're not really independent. So it might have to be done on an individual issue basis to keep it really independent.
I think that ultimately becomes true of anything that's created by and appointed by the government, is that you do ultimately get some sort of set positions. And it doesn't matter whether it's a Democratic administration that's creating and appointing or a Republican administration. And this is why I think ultimately, Tim, the answer to your question is It's public debate. It is you and others, and EDF and others, putting your positions out there. Peer-reviewed science and articles published in reputable journals so that people are informed of your positions, and that is going to inform the government. That is probably the best way to have this debate.
It's very hard. It's discouraging because it's just so noisy and so messy. And the loudest and most extreme positions, you know, get the most play on little 30-second news clips or reporters that have a minute and a half, or I mean, even NPR, where, you know, somebody has 2 minutes. There's not a very good avenue outside of universities, and that has its problems too, for having sort of polite, civilized debate about things.
Just a quick observation. Having been on, I forget how many, 15 or so National Academy committees, and currently co-chairing their report review committee, if you ask the National Academy to study what we know about ozone chemistry and science, that's something they would probably do very well. If you ask them to include what's known about health risks from ozone, I think they also could do that very well. But when you ask them to also consider all the benefits and disbenefits and wrap it up and tell us what the number should be, that gets to be a kind of a question that the committee finds itself scratching its head and saying, you know, this isn't really a science question you gave us. And those studies tend to do less well, in part because they require such diverse expertise that the problem that happens is the committee ends up with one expert on every subtext, and you really need enough experts to really argue stuff, and you don't have that on too broad a charge. Being on the co-chair of the report review committee, I get to attend every governing board executive committee meeting and look at the study prospectus for every proposed study for the academy. And the report review committee has terrific staff and has learned over the years that if it looks like a universal study of everything, it's trouble. And to raise a red flag and say, are you sure you want to do this? Can we narrow the scope to something that really makes sense? So I worry about the ambition that, Tim, your proposal has in it.
So on the very broadest point, you're raising a constitutional issue, which is the country decided, or the Constitution decides, to leave these messy scientific, economic decisions ultimately in the hands of the people of the United States. It's a little bit rough, a little bit imprecise. Takes a long time, but it does deal with the problem of having one expert that becomes an expert and thereby achieves some level of decision-making power and automatically becomes an expert in everything else, or thinks he or she is.
Sonia.
Hi, Sonia Sachs from Gradient. I think there's been a lot of good discussion, and I think Tim brought up some of the points that I wanted to make. But I think I wanted to ask, we have a current standard now that is significantly more stringent than the previous standard. And as I showed in my presentation, the risks for just attaining that standard are reduced to a degree that, you know, you could say there might be a benefit here from just meeting the current standard. But the marginal risks or the marginal benefits that you get from reducing the standard further are much more questionable. And this goes back to the uncertainty. And we do have new evidence. We have a few studies, and a few studies that are actually evaluating effects below the current standard. But they're not very compelling. And when you weigh that evidence against all of the much larger body of evidence that we have, it becomes even less compelling. So again, and I think the frustration is, again, going back to the question of uncertainty, and how should the uncertainty in the science be weighed by EPA in making these decisions? But more importantly, how should it be communicated to the administrator that is ultimately going to make this decision that, as we've all discussed here, is going to impact, other areas, cost that is going to be much more costly than anything we've seen before, but that has these uncertain benefits. I mean, we all want to protect our children. This is not, this is not a question, but it's, again, what are those marginal benefits that are so uncertain? So I just, again, maybe it's being redundant. This is a redundant theme. But again, I just want to remind, everybody that we do have a, fairly stringent standard already in place that states are having difficulty meeting now. And if we just meet that standard, there are going to be benefits.
So I have a brief reply, if I may. First of all, the work that you demonstrated suggests that the additional health benefits from a lower standard aren't compelling, but I have no doubt that there are other studies that show that there would be bigger benefits than might be shown in the work that you've done. And so, what's compelling to one person, I mean, you and I might agree, but it probably is not compelling to Elena or John or Nancy or Mary. And the other thing you said, and it's going to be expensive. Remember, there are a lot of uncertainties associated on the cost side, too. I mean, as with any clinical or epidemiological or toxicological study, there are assumptions, decisions are made about what to include and what not to include. I think Anne was very clear in her general equilibrium analysis of the cost. We assume this, we didn't assume that, et cetera, et cetera. So we shouldn't get locked into, well, we know exactly how much it's going to cost. It's going to be $154 billion nationally. That's a point estimate. It would be smaller with a different set of assumptions. It would be bigger with another set of assumptions. So we need to keep in mind there's uncertainty on both sides of the equation here. And I guess ultimately I come down that, unfortunately, all of this in the end comes down on one person who has to decide what she or he thinks is the right thing to do given those circumstances. And to briefly follow up on what Don has said, the good thing is, if you think that person, and I guess I should say, I would like a law that forces that person to be explicit about the trade-offs. I'm not doing this because I think it will cost this much money based on these studies. In my judgment, that's what's best. That information should be available to the public, not kind of buried in, well, I'm not going to go tighter because they only used 100 mice in this study or whatever. But the point I want to make is, the reason I like having a law that says you can trade off and make them explicit is, if you don't like the trade-off that EPA administrator makes, you vote for a different president the next time there's an election. That's the check that we have here, right? We don't get to vote for the EPA administrator, but we do get to vote for the president who appoints her or him. And in a way, I think that's the best we can do.
Did this information get before the administrator? You asked the question, how do we get it before EPA? How do we get them to pay attention to this? It is in the comments of various parties that have been submitted. The National Association of Manufacturers, I think, got very deep into the science on this. But, science on the other side was also presented. There is a judgment here. Policy comes into play. Couple things about costs and so forth. First, let me just say this. I will eat my shoe if the administrator goes to 65. Okay? You got me on tape saying that. I will eat a shoe. This is where cost comes into play. It's not directly acknowledged. and it is expressed in terms of uncertainty. Uncertainty of the science, uncertainty of the health benefits. And cost is salient in that. Now, Ann did an assessment of the costs, and Paul did an assessment of the costs at 65. I would love to see NERA's assessment of the cost at 70. I suspect they'd be a bit lower. And that will have some impact on Gina, whether she says it does or not.
Other comments?
I'm not going to eat my shoe.
Okay, next question.
Yes, Steve Packham. I would like to express appreciation to the Texas folks for hosting this, for putting it together. I think we all came here with some hope and expectation that we could leave with a better understanding of how the system works and how what we do, whether we're a scientist or economist or whatever, what we do might best be vectored into in a way that would have some positive impact. And I think from that standpoint, this process and these few days has been a superb success. Having said that, I have a very sort of focused question for Tom. You made the statement, and I think it's
Not the shoe one, right?
No,
Okay.
no. I've eaten my shoes several times, I'll just warn you. You said that the administrator's decision has to be supported by the record, and my question is this: if it's possible, what exactly is that record? Is that the universe of things that are on the docket that the administrator has to look at? Because and is it precedent in legal terms, in past things? What exactly is that record? In other words, if that's all they can look at, that one of the things that we need to think about is how do we get something into the record, right?
Right, absolutely, and the record is closed. It is essentially closed. You can comment now to EPA. You can tell them what's in your comments and what's in the record.
So from that, the record is what's in the docket.
The record is what is in the docket.
Okay.
It is the information that EPA compiled as they were developing the proposed rule. It is the comments themselves and the data and studies submitted with those. But it is not exclusively that. I should be clear. General knowledge, the agency's expertise, their experiences, those are all part of what they can rely on, even if it's not directly in the record. Common sense is part of the record.
Okay.
You don't simply ignore something because it didn't get formally submitted to the docket. So all the past experience of EPA is something that they can rely on. They don't have to reinvent the wheel every time they do something and say, oh, is ozone a pollutant and does it have adverse effects on people? We've already established that, so you don't need to go back and redo all those studies.
So there's an assumption of generally recognized facts or principles on which we could all agree more or less.
I'd say yes, but now you can have a big debate about
Yeah.
what's generally recognized and agreed upon.
With that, and thank you, I just wanted to clarify that. That's not really anything really to debate. The other question I had was maybe for Tom, you'd know the timing on this. What was the year that the administrator determined that, or that someone said in the administration that 75 parts per billion was legally indefensible? Was that in?
2009.
And what was the year that they said that it is legally defensible?
2011.
Okay, so here's what we're faced with, ladies and gentlemen, is that we're faced with a system that can reverse itself 180 degrees.
By the way, Steve, before you go on, let me clarify something because
I may have.
I'm going to put on my DOJ hat here for a moment. Pretend I'm still with the government. What was said in 2009 by Lisa Jackson is based on the current state of science. 75 is indefensible. What was said in 2011 is slightly different. Based on the science in 2008, it was defensible. So it's always based on what we know now. So the two positions are not necessarily
But
logically inconsistent.
whatever is new had to become new within
After
No,
KSAC made its last
but the
recommendation.
point being-
24 months.
But the
right?
point being, the second statement was looking back to the record of decision
Correct.
that was then defended in court, whereas the first statement was made after the record of decision. And in light of, presumably in light of new information that was part of the new ongoing review. So just to parse it, I mean, that's how DOJ was able to comfortably proceed to defend, and was able. I mean, there were many of us in town saying, "How's Tom going to handle this?"
So
that's how they handled
You
it.
handled it by, the first decision was based on data up till when? 2008?
2008.
And this,
Well,
Well,
pardon me,
before
I
that.
should say, it's actually earlier than that.
It was earlier.
It's
than
earlier.
that. Earlier. It was when the record of decision.
But
was-
I think it was 2006 or so.
it's when the docket was closed for
Yes.
that? Okay.
Exactly.
Okay,
Right.
so then the second decision was based on what new component of the record?
Well, there
you
is
saw?
there is no second decision.
There
What
was
you're-
second statement, and what it was based on is,
Right.
Well,
whatever it
the
was
statement,
based
though, has led to the fact that now we're facing the proposal for a new, so some decision was made.
Well, okay.
Whoa.
EPA is obligated to revisit the NACs every 5 years. They have this statutory obligation to do this again and again and again and again and again.
Oh, so it was
What
the
they have
5-year
said-
clock that
The
triggered this.
5-year clock. So what they've
Okay.
said now is the science since the last review shows effects at lower levels,
Right.
or shows with less uncertainty that there are effects at lower levels. Notably, KSAC's recommendation, 60 to 70 parts per billion, pardon me, has not changed. It's the same recommendation they made back then.
So did you think you were going to get an answer to that question?
No, I
That
wanted
wasn't a legal answer, a lawyer's answer?
I wanted clarification, and actually, I think they've done it very, very well from my perspective. That helps me. And then I would like to just close with this, again, in a complimentary way, but also a suggestive way. This process, as we've obviously experienced here, from a Lena's standpoint and from mine and from others, it's something from which I think these kinds of gatherings need to be thought about as something that we do often or again. Because as a scientist, I would have a lot to say about the fact that the administrator is not taking into consideration the body of evidence that is known about the human body, period, medically, biologically. I agree with what Mike has said and others, is that there absolutely is a threshold of effect, chemically, biologically. And the current science, quote, that everybody's talking about is a methodology that gives a straight line relationship, which is not a dose-response curve to start with, should not even be interpreted as a dose-response curve, but it has no threshold. So you have a line that no matter where you set the standard today, there is a legitimate rational argument, Paul, for making it lower. That is never going to be a problem for an administrator. They can always argue that if I go further down on that straight line, I should provide benefits to more people. It's a mathematical certainty. So there's never going to be a point where the country can rest and say, we are protecting ourselves to a reasonable degree of safety. Because someone can always come along and say, no, if you drop it another 2 parts per billion, you're going to have an impact, potentially benefit for X number of thousand people.
Yeah, I think that's right, Steve, and I think that's why, if there was no consideration of cost or uncertainty or anything like that, the KSAC recommendation would be easy to deal with. They recommend 60 to 70, well, you go to 60.
Yeah.
Clearly you
They
go to
have
60.
no option but to recommend that if all they look at is,
Right.
is the epi studies. And that's why I'm saying that part of the public record, part of the common sense, Tom, Paul, Don, and Chuck, and Chris, is it?
Yes.
Part of the public record, part of the common sense is just realizing that there is a threshold for an effect. The other rational thing is, Paul, everything that hurts us is not an adverse effect. If you go to workout, your body is going to hurt. And what's the trainer going to say? No pain, no gain, right? Things can hurt for several reasons. They can hurt because you're growing and improving. They can hurt because your body's designed to make something hurt when it sees a threat and the body needs to get out of it. The burning eyes is not an adverse effect, it's a protective effect. It's protective. And so
well,
I think we just,
That's your view, and other people have a different
and
view.
and so I'll come back to my closing thing. It's because of that, Paul and others, that I think this kind of interaction is really important. Because when I do my studies, I need to be thinking about Paul. You know, Paul, you've affected my life for the next however long I have.
That's something none of my students can say.
Yeah. I think I'm
or
more
your wife.
sensitive. I'm more sensitive than your wife. You are certainly going to be a part of my dreams. But in any case, I think that we have a situation here where, again, it's helpful to know what our role is and what we can do, and I appreciate the opportunity to be part of this.
Before somebody else says that, I want to say one more thing, Steve, though. Remember, even if we're allowed to balance benefits and costs, and we get to the point where we say 0.75 is the lowest that you can justify, given the way I assess the weight of the evidence on both sides, I don't think it's worth it. Remember, if somebody comes up with a very inexpensive way to reduce volatile organic compound emissions or nitrogen oxide emissions, the marginal cost curve drops, and then you could justify a tighter standard. It's not just accretion of health evidence that would push one way or the other. It's also what happens on the cost side. And if it becomes cheaper, then an administrator might say, well, you know, it's not going to be that disruptive to tighten it another, you know, from 7.5 to 7 or whatever. So both of those sizes.
And since all of these wheels are turning, I think that argues even more persuasively for this kind of thing being an ongoing process.
Right. And so I hope you'll support a bigger budget each year for TCEQ. I mean this. For TCEQ.
I would, except I've got to now go home and try to meet the ozone standard.
I've
But
got-
if I have any leftover money, I'd be happy.
I've got you.
Roger McClellan, let me just emphasize, these things are ongoing processes. I've been involved in this since the mid-'70s. I reviewed the first ozone standard, which was based on, you know, a document not much bigger than this that had been prepared by the National Research Council. That was the basis of that first one. But as we go along, the process is ongoing. Here we're talking about what you might do catch-up-wise, kind of at the end, as going down the home stretch. The place to get involved is early in the process. EPA just announced they held a workshop to start the process for the review of the PM 2.5 standard. These same arguments are going to go on there. I participated telephonically in that. I was dismayed at how few individuals from the scientific community participated in that, other than EPA staff and the in-crowd. Now, there will be meetings coming along in terms of the draft integrated science assessment. Show up there. It is not as siloed, you know, and I've been critical of KSAC because I've been on it. there is a lot of debate that goes on. And it's not just the epi, it's not just the animal. I can tell you, everybody's there arguing for their favorite bag of tricks that they're most important. But I would say there are very few from the scientific community that ever show up at those. It costs money. Well, but if you're going to be in the game, you got to play in the game. So I just encourage people to do that. I encourage the broadest possible dialogue. I will end by saying, as I've said before, as much as scientists would like to think the science can give you the answer, it's not sufficient. The science informs the policy judgments, and I don't care how you describe the uncertainty. The more complex your description of uncertainty gets, the less likely it's going to be seen and understood by the administrator. And I say that from experience. Probably the most, quote, despised EPA administrator, Ann Gorsuch, I had the most thoughtful discussions about NACs with. She repeatedly said, I don't understand, to Sheldon Friedlander and myself as we described the science, and we went back over it again and again. And I tell you, that happens with every EPA administrator. They're smart people. They get their staff in there and they grill the hell out of them, try to explain it, because they don't want to be caught short. So they're not just looking in a silo at epi or tox, whatever. They're looking at the whole big picture, making those policy judgments. That's just a nice way of saying a political decision. So I just encourage those who are interested, get involved, follow it along, go to that EPA NACs page, see what the next meeting is, and they go on and on. You can make a lifetime career out of it.
Thank you, Roger. Ann?
Pull this one back and try and reach it. I've got so many questions that I don't even know where to begin, so I'm just going to start with one that I think I can actually articulate clearly enough to get people giving some feedback. And that has to do with the way the term adverse and an adverse event or adverse effect has been used differently over and over in this meeting, but also prior to this meeting. It was actually something I was aware of. Different parties in these debates have different terms, use of the terms. We hear there's a medical term for adverse, which I won't pretend to know how to define from what I've heard, but that was discussed on first day. And there's a term, as Paul Portney uses it, that I'd call an economist term, which is it's in the eye of the beholder. I would think of that as more of almost a willingness to pay that fits into a benefit cost framework. But you can imagine that can be could be used as the term adverse that would determine whether the standard needs to be set more tightly or not, even if it doesn't rise to a medical definition of adverse. I also heard Henry Nickel talk about the fact that adverse effect means evidence of a demonstrable harm, which I'm not sure is exactly the same thing as the medical definition. And then Henry Nickel also said, in fact, the word adverse isn't, the term adverse or adverse effect is not what's really necessary to show the need to tighten the standard, that there is this issue of is there a risk of some form of effect, and I'm not sure if it's an adverse effect or not. So I guess my question is, there's sort of a legal question here. Can somebody parse this out? Is there any kind of way of saying which definition actually should be used or needs to be used under the Clean Air Act so that we can start to define our terms to have these conversations and make them perhaps a little more directed? Thanks.
So I'd like to hear what Don has to say, but let me say that adverse health effect, adequate margin of safety, unreasonable risk, sensitive population, I think the language, as in the laws in the Constitution, I mean, are elastic. And I think on the whole, that's a good thing. I mean, as times change, It gives us the ability to interpret these terms differently. It's frustrating for people because when administrations change, the laws don't change, but all of a sudden it's like all the laws have changed. Either they're being enforced vigorously, or all of a sudden people say, oh, no, if you're not in attainment, we'll give you more time, etc. But, you know, in a way, I think the framers of the Constitution did this deliberately so that they have not been precise. Not every single word is defined, so that people can interpret this differently in the context of changes in time. But I'm an economist, I'm not a lawyer, and maybe Chuck and Tom would have a different view of this, but there's a downside to the ambiguity in statutory language, but there's an upside that I think we need to realize too.
Go ahead.
I was just going to say that this is a problem across the government, with different agencies having different definitions that is much simpler than adverse effect. You would think something like name. We could all agree, like how the government should ask that, but that's not the case. You know, one agency adds first name, last name, middle name first. Another agency a different way. Another agency who doesn't care about your first name at all. And you try to get them in a room to say, can't we agree on one form of name? And part of OMB's job is to do that in the statistical world, to define what the categories of information that the census collects, for example, race and ethnicity. And it's a terrible problem when you try to get people together to fix those, because everybody has their own statute and their own past. So it's a common problem. I would agree with you that it would be nice in the medical science community to have a little more agreement. Economists are always out there in left field anyway, and lawyers too. It's hard to get those three avenues. I guess I better stop.
Yeah, and I think, as Henry noted the first day, there was a shift in '77 from, the demonstrable harm, adverse effect taken out of 109 with respect to primary but not secondary. So it's still there with respect to secondary standard. And to an endangerment determination, risk of harm. So, so one way of viewing it, and it fits in with our discussion, is the administrator as a risk manager, risk management decisions, the risk of harm. And it also fits in with Breyer's prior statements, where he specifically says retains discretionary authority to avoid regulating risks that it reasonably concludes are trivial in context. I told Mike I was going to do this, and I'll do it now. Coming out of today, so some might say it's cost, right? But it's really context matters. We've heard that a lot. And where does it come from? It comes from Breyer. Nor are the words requisite in public health to be understood independent of context. So what do you say about that? He says, the statute's words then authorize the administrator to consider the severity of a pollutant's potential adverse health effects, the number of those likely to be affected, the distribution of the adverse effects, the uncertainty surrounding each estimate. There's the roadmap. There's the roadmap. They permit the administrator to take into account the comparative health consequences. They allow her to take into account take account of context when determining the acceptability of small risks to health. And they give her considerable discretion when she does so. The discretion would seem sufficient to avoid the extreme results that some in industry parties fear. After all, the EPA, in setting standards that protect public health with an adequate margin of safety, retains discretionary authority to avoid regulating risks that it reasonably concludes are trivial in context. That goes back to discussion we've had many times. Watery eyes, shortening of breath. Well, is that trivial? Is that meaningful? Are we going to regulate for it? nor need regulation lead to deindustrialization. Pre-industrial society was not very healthy society, hence a standard demanding the return to the Stone Age would not prove requisite to protect public health. I really think, almost kind of summing up where we are, that articulation by Breyer is a roadmap for taking into account what's been said over the last couple days. There's a range of possible outcomes from that roadmap, but there is a roadmap there. But it's up to the administrator to avail herself of it.
All right, Chuck, let me.
Housekeeping, could I ask, is there some way to make sure that that language is somehow put on a slide or given so that we can find it quickly?
We'll make sure,
Can we do that?
Yeah, they'll handle that. And context matters.
Chuck, I think you've given a nice summary to this morning's session, actually, right there. Let me invite all the panelists to take a couple of minutes, if they like, to sum up what they thought were the high points or to emphasize any points they feel didn't get sufficient attention, and then we'll turn it back over to Michael. Tom, first.
Well, I think that the bottom line you need to take away from all of this is the one that Roger just gave earlier, which is if you want to make your case to EPA, get involved early. You need to make your case through the record. You need to make a compelling case in order to have some effect on the outcome of these rulemakings. When you get to the courts, deference is going to be in favor of the agency. So make your efforts early, make them strong.
Don?
I've enjoyed the coffee a lot. It's a very high quality. So I would, and I agree with various comments that engagements like this that bring different people together to listen to each other's expertise are really a critical part of the public comment, and then finding a way to communicate that to our elected and appointed officials is what makes the country move ahead.
Thank you. Paul?
I think most people would agree that I've said enough, so I won't say any more. Thanks for the opportunity to be here.
All right. Chuck, last word?
I said yes to the invitation because I really thought it would be fun and also illuminating, and it's exceeded my expectations. Really appreciate the opportunity to be here, and thank you to TCEQ for pulling it all together.
Now, let me add my thanks to the organizers. I think this has been a terrific meeting. I thank all four of you for most interesting comments.